My name is Paul McKibben, and I'm going to discuss Decoupled Drupal 8. Who here has played around with decoupling of CMS and the front end? So about a third of the room. Some of you who have been doing this probably have much more deep experience than I do in this, and feel free to chime in, add information. I'm pretty new to this. This has been an experiment for me, and I'm going to show you the results of my experimentation. This is going to be kind of a back-end focused presentation and not so much a front-end focused presentation. I'm not using any front-end frameworks, no AngularJS, no React.js, nothing like that. This will purely be a demonstration or a discussion of what decoupling is and what it means, and a quick demonstration with a very simple HTML and JavaScript jQuery app on the front end. So let's get started here. Feel free to stop me at any time and ask questions. I have not checked the time of this presentation, so hopefully we'll fit everything in, but I would much rather be useful to you, so if you have questions, feel free to stop me. We can go on tangents or whatever. About me, I have been using Drupal since about 2007. Now run my own web consultancy called Turbojet Technologies, but previously I've been with MediaCurrent and CSE and Digital Valence, which got acquired by CSE. Got some pretty deep experience building sites on Drupal 5, 6, 7, and even 8. I led the development of the Manhattan Associates site on Drupal 8. I love tinkering and experimenting, and this is what this presentation is about. I have not actually developed a live decoupled site yet. But today we're going to talk about what decoupling is, talk about REST and JSON, which are the technologies and protocols that really enable decoupling, discuss Drupal 8 and why it's the best for REST, show a demo of Drupal 8 content being pulled into a JavaScript application, discuss a little bit about BigPipe. Josh Koenig kind of stole my thunder there. I didn't know he was going to do that, but he already talked a little bit about that this morning, so I don't have to go very deep into that at all. And hopefully there will be some time for Q&A. Feel free to stop me again at any time. So, decoupling. For those of you who don't know, decoupling is basically taking the front end of your Drupal site and moving it to something else. So, a traditional Drupal site, Drupal controls everything. It controls the front end, it controls the theme. Drupal renders an entire HTML page for every request and sends it to your browser, and your browser shows it to you. In a decoupled architecture, you'll have maybe a simple HTML static application with some JavaScript in it. You might use a JavaScript framework like React.js or Angular. But the browser will load that HTML framework and then use REST to get all the information from Drupal and use what's called client-side rendering to render it on your screen. Any questions about that? So why do this? Well, this sounds hard. Why even bother? It could result in some performance improvements if you do it right. You load a single page, and then you just load pieces of content as you need it in your browser. That could be a lot faster than going from page to page in your Drupal site and loading each individual page each time. It also lets you have full control over your site's markup and your user experience. Drupal likes to do things its way, and so when you're building a Drupal site and you want to control the presentation, you often have to fight Drupal to get it to look the way you want. If you're writing your HTML from scratch and then loading your content in from Drupal later, you have full control. Another advantage of decoupling is that on the Drupal side of things, you're providing an API for others to get your content. It's great for what they call COPE architectures, create once, publish everywhere. NPR does something like that in distributing its contents to its affiliates. It also lets you create an application-like experience. So, how many of you have used Pinterest, for example? You can point on things, you move them around. It's very point and click. You almost don't realize you're using the website. So with a decoupled architecture, it's much easier to create those kinds of JavaScript-rich applications and then pull your content in from Drupal. And then finally, many people who are choosing decoupled architectures now are doing it because they go through design refreshes every couple of years. And when you retheme a Drupal site, that often affects the whole end-to-end architecture of your site, front-end, back-end, content types, everything. If you do it right, and you have a very solid API defined on your back end, you can refresh the front end as many times as you like and keep using the same API on the back end, which means you don't have to rebuild your whole Drupal infrastructure. You're just redesigning. And also, front-end developers don't need to learn Drupal. That's often a great big hurdle for bringing new people into Drupal. And so I have seen clients who are very interested in decoupled architectures purely for this reason. Their front-end developers can use what they're familiar with, like AngularJS, for example, and they don't have to learn about Drupal theming and Twig and everything else. This is a quote from the Twit website. How many people are familiar with Twit? It's a podcast network created by a radio guy named Leo Laporte. He has had a radio show for probably a few decades now. But he decided he wanted to redesign Twit.tv, his podcast network's website, in a headless Drupal architecture. And he had 4 kitchens rebuild it for them. This is a quote from his press release about why he did this. He basically wants to make his content available to anybody, to create mobile apps, Roku apps, Xbox apps, whatever. Pull in Twit videos and allow people to see them, see what the schedule is, watch them, without having to jump through a ton of hoops. So they've got a Drupal 7 site that's headless that has a very well-defined REST API that anyone can go in there and use to build an app for whatever platform may come around. That's why he did it. But decoupling creates problems. It's not some sort of panacea. One thing is that you lose everything that Drupal already gives you for free. For example, making sure your markup is secure. Making sure you don't have any cross-site scripting attacks. Rendering your website within a theme. If you don't code HTML, Drupal will do it for you. You just plug in a theme and you go to town and build your site. If you're going to do a decoupled architecture, it means you actually have to develop a front end. It's no longer a single system in a decoupled architecture. You now have at least 2 pieces, maybe even more if you look at some of the more complex architectures out there, like what Lullabot did, where they have MongoDB in the middle and more. It's more complexity, it requires more discipline. It's a lot of extra work to architect and maintain something like this. There are SEO challenges if you have a JavaScript app. Google and other bots want to crawl URLs and be able to point to content, which means your JavaScript app has to have some kind of URL for each piece of content that it supports. If you don't architect your app, according to Google's Webmaster Guidelines, you could lose SEO. Mobile device impacts. Some less capable devices in particular, if you're using a big JavaScript framework, it may be slow to load, may use extra processing, it may drain the battery. So a quote from Dries in his blog post during DrupalCon Barcelona, he says that building a decoupled application on top of a CMS will result in a crippling loss of critical functionality or skyrocketing costs. His opinion, but a valid one. So, is decoupling good or bad? Yes, it is. It's good or bad. I think what you really have to do is have a really good reason to do it. In my case, I'm doing it because I want to learn about it, and I want to learn about the pitfalls. I haven't actually launched a live site on it yet, but my consultancy website will probably use this architecture. But for my reasons, I want to learn more about it and actually get familiar with everything about it. It's not for everybody. So next part of this is to go through the technologies that make decoupling possible, REST and JSON. So what is REST? It stands for Representational State Transfer. Make sense? It doesn't make sense to me either. In plain English, what it means is you use HTTP request verbs, get, post, patch, and delete, to read and manipulate resources on a server. That's really what it means. So, get to get a resource, post to create one, patch to modify, delete to remove. So, simple example, classic web page that's been around since 1993. Your browser sends a request to a server to get a page. What is that thing there highlighted? It's a URL, Uniform Resource Locator. So the key word here is resource. When you point your browser at a URL, it does a GET request for this resource, and it displays this resource to you. Oops, that's jumped. But anyway, REST uses HTTP verbs, like I said, to get these resources. In the early days of the web, these resources were pages. When you're using REST, you really just need to lose the idea of a page. And so the resources on Drupal may be a node, maybe a user, maybe a taxonomy term, or who knows what else. What you want to do is think in terms of resources and not pages when you're doing a decoupled app. You load one page, and then you get resources and display them on that page. Any questions so far? All right. So the other part of this is JSON. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's actually JavaScript code that wraps data in an object. So what it means is that when your application retrieves a resource, and this resource is returned in JSON format, it can natively read that and parse it very nicely. And most other languages, including PHP, have JSON encoders and decoders. So it makes it very easy to parse, much easier than XML or HTML. So here's a very simple example. A node title. If you just pull the node title out of what Drupal gives you on a page, you got this H1, which is a bunch of the classes, and a span, and more classes and properties and data, and inside all that, you see the title. This is the first blog post. JSON format, much easier to read. You have this object, has an attribute title, which has a value that contains the title. JavaScript reads that natively. It's so much nicer. So how does this all apply to Drupal 8? So why Drupal 8 is best for REST. In Drupal 7 and before, you could do REST, and people are doing it. But you have to kind of trick Drupal into making it work. Drupal 7 assumes every request it gets right now is a page. And contributing modules then go in and trick Drupal into sending JSON responses to REST requests instead of pages. It's not very efficient because every request goes through this same heavy bootstrap process. Then somehow, through some hook, your module gets invoked. It then kind of hijacks the response and sends it back as a JSON response. Whereas with Drupal 8, there's a new HTTP kernel that's provided through Symfony 2. And also a REST module in core. Between those, Drupal 8 handles REST natively. Requests that come in, get, put, patch, delete, all those requests get routed to particular modules based on routes, and it goes to controllers. So a lot lighter bootstrap process. And then the responses can be a full HTML page, a partial HTML snippet, or JSON, or anything else. So much more efficient. So we talked about decoupling pros and cons, and I'm not even convinced that decoupling's right. If you don't decouple, you can still use REST. There's a lot of possibilities. You have a Drupal front end, then loads in more with AJAX using REST requests. Use content distribution to external applications like twit.tv is doing. You can use it for content staging. You have a staging server, you could put content on it, and then use REST requests from one server to the other to actually push the content to production. And that you could think of more of how REST could be useful even if you don't go into decoupling. Here are the REST-related modules in Drupal 8 that I've used in this demo that we're about to see. There are 4 in core. The main one is RESTful Web Services, and then everything else is on top of it. There's an authentication module that lets you actually do a Drupal login using REST. There's a HAL module that uses something called Hypertext Application Language that basically adds extra data to your JSON to kind of make the API self-documenting. Feel free to dig deeper into that if you are interested. I barely understand it myself. And serialization allows data to be represented as text. There's one contrib module that I installed called REST UI that allows you to configure what REST operations are allowed on what entities. If you don't have REST UI, you can still use the configurations system, by manually inserting and updating configuration in Drupal 8. But the REST UI makes it a lot easier. For today's demo, what I'm going to do, I'll show an application that does a get on individual nodes and also retrieve a list of nodes. I'll go into more details on that in the demo itself. What I'm going to do here, I've actually got a server, a Vagrant server on my Mac here with two doc routes. One is HTML and JavaScript, no Drupal at all. The other is Drupal, and it's just a server. So the front end is turbojettech.local, and the server is server.turbojettech.local. What will happen is the browser will load the HTML page from turbojettech.local, and then update that page using REST and JSON from the server. Questions about that? So let's go into the demo. So first, it's very hard for me to see this. I apologize. So here's the Drupal side of things. What I'm going to show first is how we set this up to allow an external client to get individual nodes from Drupal. There is a REST section under Web Services. And this is actually provided by the REST UI module. If you don't have the REST UI module, you don't have this GUI screen here. I'm sorry, yes. I actually have an alias there. So it's the same. It's actually the same box. Admin and server are the same box. The same site? Same site. It's actually the same. One is an alias for the other. So I apologize for the confusion there. So what I have done is used this UI to enable GET requests only on nodes. You can actually set it up to allow other requests as well. You may remember I talked about post, delete, and patch. But I decided, for security reasons, I don't want my client being able to do that. I just want it to be able to retrieve. And when we want to create data, we'll just go into the Drupal backend and do it. So that's one part of it. The other is you have to actually set up permissions to allow anonymous requests. So where you do that is in the permission screen. Down here. RESTful Web Services. So the anonymous user can access GET on content resources. So you both have to set up the REST UI as well as the Drupal permission system to make this work. Yes?
If you were going to allow post or patch or delete on that, does your front-end application have to manage authentication and that sort of thing?
Yes, and there is a way to actually use a REST request to log in a user. I have not gone that deep into it. Has anybody else here tried it? Okay. Anybody want to share what it takes to make that happen?
It's just a matter of, again, configuration, saying that you're going to allow you to define it as a service.
Yeah.
You open it up, and basically you're just sending across, almost like AJAX, you're sending across the username and password, and it allows the login, and it sends a return back that it was successful or not.
Wow, so you really have to secure that as well.
Yeah, so I'm assuming you do that over HTTPS.
You could use OpenAuth or something more secure, I think.
Right.
Is what you would want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Any of those services, once you're still going to have to maintain the authenticate. Securing the authentication itself is the easy part. It's maintaining a secure session throughout the interaction that's the harder challenge.
Yeah.
The authentication itself is actually pretty easy.
Right.
After then it gets interesting.
Yep.
It's complicated too if you got to manage cores. That gets complicated.
Yep. And speaking of that, I did have to at least add something to my htaccess file for Drupal. There it is right there. In order to allow my clients to get nodes and such, I actually had to add an access control allow origin header to my HTTP responses. Otherwise, the JavaScript sandboxes on the browsers would reject it, saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. There's no allow origin header on it.
So it doesn't consider those two hosts as two hosts within the same domain?
I think because the server is actually on a subdomain, I think that's why it didn't work. I think if the server were on the primary domain and the client were on a subdomain, I think it would have worked.
Well, what you could do would be some kind of a path patterns, which basically route one to one doc root and another to another doc root based on the prefix.
Yeah, sure.
That way they are both on the same host name and right.
But in again, the Twit TV example, if you want to open this up to allow everybody to get your content, then you most certainly need that allow origin header there. Okay, anyway, back to the Drupal site here. The other thing I did was, okay, we can get individual nodes, but wouldn't it be nice also to be able to get a list of nodes? And Views is very well set up for this. Views is in core in Drupal 8, and you can actually set up a view to return a REST response. So, Views here real quick. What you do is you create a REST export display. So I've got that here, but I'll just show what the GUI looks like when you're adding a brand new one first. It lets you provide a REST export. So if you want to provide a list of anything via REST, you can create a view and provide a REST export. Article list I did here is very simple. I just took nodes of type article that are published and listed them in reverse chronological order and provided just a few simple fields, title, author date, node ID, etc. So now let's take a look at what these look like in JSON. So I've got a plugin here, a browser plugin called Advanced REST Client. There's several things you could use. There's one called Postman, I think. But what I'm doing with this is allowing it, sending REST requests and viewing what the responses look like. So if you get the list of articles here, for example, you can see all the headers, and then you can see what the response is. And it's a very simple JSON response. You got your list of nodes, your title, your NID, path, everything, things a client might need to just provide a very simple list of titles and link to them. So here on my very simple, this is not going to launch live. This is just my initial attempt at this. If I click on the blog link here, there's that list of titles. This one I added just a few minutes ago before this started. The art of finishing presentations at the last minute. So now let's look at an individual node. Let's look at this one. What I will do is look at it here, and we can look at it on the Drupal admin side as well. This is node 2. Oops. That's all from that right. There. So you can see they look quite different. So this illustrates one of the challenges if you decide to go decoupled, is that you no longer can rely on Drupal to really format the content the way you want it. You're going to have complete control and complete obligation to format it yourself from the data it gives you. Let's look and see what it gives, what the JSON looks like. Yes?
Quick question. With using views to build your REST response in Drupal 8, what's the call stack look like there for getting that response when you make the request versus what it was in Drupal 7?
Oops. What does the call stack look like?
Yeah, it's like the bootstrap process, I guess. There is views itself decoupled from the process as well.
As I understand it, views, the request goes through a very minimal bootstrap and then goes directly to the views controllers. So that path is defined in views. That path then goes to a controller that's owned by views. Views will then process the response and send back REST and JSON. So it doesn't, you don't have to hijack anything.
Yeah, I don't need it being loaded to get my JSON response.
Right.
Thanks, Drupal.
Yeah. So let's look at some of the code that handles this. Another question.
You're going to pull up the JSON.
Oh, you want to pull it? That's right. Let's look at the JSON there, actually. Thank you. Sorry. So the JSON. Here's what it looks like. You get, your NID, your UUID, you get a whole bunch of stuff. What I did was I took the image, the title, and the body. This is the body it gives you. You have to display it and put your CSS around it. And I also found I had to manipulate the inline image. I don't know if you can see this very well. Yeah. Here's an inline image right here using a relative URL. However, that relative URL is relative to the server and not the client. So without somehow manipulating that URL, client's not going to be able to display it. So what I had to do is actually create a regular expression in the code. Here, load blog post. Can't see it well enough from this angle here. Yeah. 58, yeah, thank you. So I actually had to do a string replace to add the server domain to the front of the URL in order to be able to load that inline image. So again, just another example of why decoupling is hard, and if you want to do decoupling, you need to be ready for some of these pitfalls. Anything? Now that's an interesting thing. I'm actually loading the node using the native REST entity. I could have, and I haven't tried this yet, that was my next step if I had had the time. What if I created a view that just loaded one node and then manipulated the URL? Again, it's work. It's work that, have to do somewhere, whether it's in the code or in the view. But, yeah.
That would also beg the question of how much, theming gets fired up that may not need to be.
Right.
How many templates is it going to try and pull in?
Yeah, and again, it's not pulling in any theme templates here because this is code that resides on the client. It's not on Drupal, so it's actually taking the raw markup and displaying it with its own CSS and its own JavaScript. Yeah, it's jQuery. Yep, I'm not using any framework because I haven't learned any yet. All right. So that's pretty much the extent of the demo. Are there any questions? Any other questions? Yes.
Does it circumvent any problems with mixed content? Should you be going from HTTP and HTTPS?
That's a really good question. Your client could be HTTPS and do HTTP internally if you're on the same server, for example, and you may be able to circumvent some things like that, if that's what you're asking.
We have some HTTPS servers that we have to pull in content from other places, and we usually have to try and fight the mixed content warning. So
okay.
That's just going to get worse. The browsers are getting. Google's decided that that's not something they consider acceptable anymore. So JavaScript simply won't fire across the security protocols anymore.
That's going to be fun.
Google actually ranks you higher now in SEO if you're all HTTPS.
They do.
Yeah. So hopefully HTTPS will get easier where it won't require so much headache just to set up a certificate and everything else. Until then, it's going to be a fun world. Any other questions before I go back to the presentation? Yes?
What about the registry module? That's where you make all your modifications. So then you also said that there's a config file that you can modify manually.
Yes.
That REST UI module, does it modify the config file?
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's exactly what it does.
So you don't need the REST UI when you deploy.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. You don't need the REST UI. The REST UI is purely an administrative convenience. Anything else? Go back. Let's skip all that and go here. Presentation. All right. So, yes, we see decoupling's hard. I think some of us are up to it. Others, it may not be worth the effort. So, what hope do you have? And Josh already went into this a little bit at the keynote just now, but I'll say a little bit more about it. There's BigPipe, which has been integrated into Drupal 8. I think there's still a lot of work to be done there, but at least there's some initial work that has been done. But as Josh was saying, BigPipe is something that was created by Facebook to do progressive rendering. How many people use Facebook? All right. You log into Facebook, you see the big blue bar, you see your profile picture, and you see in the content area, you see this little funny gray lines for a little bit, and then all of a sudden your content appears. That's what progressive rendering is. And Drupal is starting to do more of that now. It basically lazy loads what Facebook calls pagelets into the shell of the site. So in Drupal 8, the new HTTP kernel makes this a lot more possible. There is a backport to Drupal 7, but with Drupal 8 and the fact that not everything is assumed to be a page, you can do things like HTML snippets and such, and AJAX a lot more easily. So here's a video. This came from Dree's blog post, but it shows a comparison of rendering between a traditional Drupal site and a site with BigPipe. I'm going to pause it here real quick just to point out, because this goes by really fast. You have a page that has content that everybody sees. It's the main article, and then you have some stuff on the left sidebar that's personalized, stuff that you've maybe most listened to. It's not going to change as frequently, but it does change. And then currently listening to changes very frequently. So the point that the video is making is that it's personalized but cacheable. This is personalized but cacheable. This is the next thing is personalized but not cacheable. Let it go through all this. It's demonstrating different parts of the page. What we're going to show now is a side-by-side demonstration. You'll see on the left side, you're waiting. On the right side, you already see your article. You already see the header. The overall rendering time is the same, but the right side appears faster because the stuff it can render now gets rendered now. It's showing a demonstration with warm caches as well. The total time is faster, but again, just using BigPipe, the experience seems faster because what they call the time to first byte or the time to first paint is much, much faster than it is on a traditional Drupal site. So that's what BigPipe is. Yes?
So for caching the authenticated user content, is that going to be built in now? I mean, that's always been custom coding.
So caching the authenticated user content, that is actually supported through cache tags now. What it's going to require, especially in the contrib module space, is for the developers to put that extra caching metadata to tell BigPipe what's cacheable under what circumstances. Yes?
So, but for REST, BigPipe might not be applicable at all.
Right. For REST, BigPipe might not be applicable at all. What I'm saying here is that for those who saw all this and said, wow, REST is just too much trouble, Drupal gives you something now that it didn't before that will improve the performance of your site.
So what can we as either developer or site builders do to take advantage of BigPipe, or do we get it for free?
You get BigPipe for free in core. If you're developing custom or contributed modules, what you want to make sure you do is put in cacheability metadata into whatever you render. Everything's rendered through a render array. And in there, there's metadata that you put about what's cacheable under what circumstances, whether it's universally cacheable, whether it's cacheable per user, what the time to live should be. There is an excellent presentation from DrupalCon Barcelona. I believe Josh referenced it. It's the one by Wim Leers and Fabian Franz. I may have it on my list of resources here.
So once we add those tags, do we have to do anything else to turn on BigPipe, or it's on?
It's on. Now there are some issues in the issue queue with BigPipe. Yeah, this is the one I'm talking about here. This is the presentation by Wim Leers and Fabian Franz that talks about BigPipe and Drupal's caching, called "Making Drupal Fly." So if you get the slides, you can get a copy of my slides here at this tiny URL. You can go get those resources. So that's the end. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Feel free to come talk to me if you have any further questions, or tell me how full of it I am. Thank you all.